Okay, so today we're talking about relative clauses of purpose. So up to this point, for purpose clauses, we've been using oot, right? So oot has been our normal our normal thing that we've been using, but the reality is that oot is not actually the most frequently used subordinate conjunction. What actually usually introduces subordinate clauses are relative pronouns instead of oot. They started with oot because it's easier, and relative clauses in general are harder to learn. So it's sort of like you learned an easy way to do it, but it's not the most common way that it's done. So in Latin, usually when you want to express a purpose clause, you know, in order that this might happen, or in order to, or to do this, you're actually going to use a relative pronoun instead of oot. Okay, so I'm just going to start here by saying relative pronouns are usually used instead of oot to express purpose clauses. Okay, so in that case, you're basically making the relative pronoun match with its antecedent like you normally would in gender and in case. Gender and number, not in case. So it's always going to be the subject of this clause, of the subordinate clause. So it's always going to be nominative, but you're basically going to just use you're going to make it match in gender and in number with whatever its antecedent is. So we're going to say that the relative pronoun must match its antecedent. And the lights in the building just shut off, so hang on one second. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that. So we're saying relative pronouns must match its antecedent in gender and number. Its case will always be nominative. Its case will always be nominative. Okay, sorry, just wanted to check something real quick. Okay, so the reason that it's always going to be nominative is it's always going to be the subject of its own clause. So we're going to be saying stuff like this. For example, he sent envoys who should treat of the affair. He sent envoys who should treat of the affair. So in this case, this who, we're going to analyze this. It's essentially acting as a subordinate conjunction. It's introducing a relative clause. That relative clause is a subordinate relative clause. That's acting like that's a purpose clause. So when we analyze this, we actually are going to analyze the who as nominative. And in this case, since it's going back to envoys, nominative, plural, and masculine. Most of the time, in a lot of the sentences that you're going to see, it is going to be nominative, plural, and masculine, which is qui. So you're going to see qui as your relative pronoun here to introduce a purpose clause really often. It's going to be pretty. It's not going to be super often that it's otherwise. The rules that we had of subordinate clauses still apply. So just like we had primary tenses, right? If you have a primary tense, either present, future, or future perfect in your main clause verb, then you're going to use the present subjunctive in your subordinate clause. And if you have the secondary tenses, either perfect, imperfect, or pluperfect in the main clause, then you're going to have a imperfect subjunctive in your subordinate clause. So in this case, since sent is third, singular, and perfect, we're looking at a secondary tense, right? Secondary tense. And so over here, we're going to make we're going to make this third, plural, and imperfect subjunctive. Okay. So remember, the primary and secondary tense rules, primary and secondary tense rules still apply. So the primary and secondary tense rules still apply to how we're going to translate. Okay, so the only exception, there is an exception here where we have to use ut. So the situation, so this is kind of the tricky bit about this. The tricky bit about this is when to use ut, right? If we're normally using a relative pronoun instead of ut, when do you use ut? So in your book, it describes when to use ut. It is whenever the relative pronoun would have to refer back to the subject of a, what does it say? To the subject of a active main verb. Sorry, just had to double check. Of an active main verb. So when you use ut is if the relative pronoun would refer back to the subject of an active main verb. So you're going to look at the sentence. For example, if we had, let's say, he attacked the enemy in order to destroy. Well, let's use a word that we actually need. He attacked the enemy in order to terrify them. Okay, so I'm going to look at this, and basically you're just asking yourself: is the person who's acting in your main clause also the actor in your subordinate clause? If it is, then you're going to use ut. So here we've got the actor is he, and that same actor or that same subject is this actor over here. It's the same guy, same person who's doing the action. And so in that case, I have to use ut instead, because you would essentially be saying he attacked the enemy who to terrify them, which doesn't make any sense, right? Whereas if we say he sent the cavalry who should attack them. He sent the cavalry who should attack them. There, the who is fine because it's going back to its antecedent, which is the direct object of the previous sentence. So the reality is that a lot of your sentences are still going to use ut because of this exception. You have a lot of sentences that are in the active voice, and you've got a lot of them where the person doing the action in the main clause is also the person doing the action in the subordinate clause. So that's the first thing you always want to check. You want to look at the sentence and say to yourself, okay, just double check, is it an active main verb? That means active, not passive, right? And if it's an active main verb, is the guy or is the person doing it the same person who's doing the action in the subordinate clause? And you always just want to check that first. If that's not the case, if it's passive, then you're going to use, so that's kind of the rule here. If it's passive in the main verb, use a relative pronoun. So if it's passive, you're going to be using the relative pronoun every time. If it's active, you've just got to check whether the person doing the action is the same person in both clauses. So an example of the opposite, right? So let me do an example of the passive here first. So let's say he was attacked in order to frighten him. He was attacked in order to frighten him. And let's do it. He was attacked by the enemy. Since I've got was attacked as passive voice, right? Since that's passive, that means that over here I'm going to use a nominative, plural, masculine, going back to enemy, which is the antecedent. I'm going to use qui to introduce that relative clause. Okay, I know it's kind of a tricky concept. The first exercise you guys are going to do is all just sentences that basically have qui as their as the relative as the subordinate conjunction that's introducing the subordinate clause. And I believe in your other exercises, the English to Latin exercises you're going to do, it's a little bit more of a mix. So with those ones, you're going to want to look at it and check, right, what we talked about here with the exception. You're going to want to look at that and see whether it's the case or not. Okay. To finish this video, just wanted to talk real quick about vocabulary. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things with vocabulary. I'm just going to run through the words like we normally would. So we've got deduco, deducere, deduxi, deductus, to lead, lead away. All we can see here that this is just duco, ducere, duxi, ductus with de added. So it's literally to lead away. That's the de part of it. Next, cognosco, cognoscere, cognovi, cognitus, to learn, find out. It's pretty straightforward. The rest of these, I believe, are pretty straightforward. Let me just talk real quick about this note. So we've learned 3 conjunctions at this point now. 3 different conjunctions. I'm not going to write this up on the board. I think you guys can figure this out. Basically, que, you just add it onto the end of a word. And you can see the examples there. The most kind of obvious one is the name of the Roman Republic, which is Senatus Populusque Romanus. So in that example, I'll do a little note about this, I guess. Senatus Populusque Romanus. So you're basically putting the que at the end of the second item that's being added. So normally you could say like Senatus et Populus Romanus. But putting the que here is the strongest form of connection because you're literally putting these 2 words as close together as possible. There's no conjunction in between them. They're just right next to each other. So that's why it's the strongest of all your conjunctions because it's putting the 2 words literally right next to one another. The last thing is derivatives. I think injured is pretty clear. It's an adjective in this case. So we're saying the injured bird or something like that. A nuncio is basically a papal messenger. So it's just a very specific word that means somebody who's bringing messages for the Pope. Deduction is a little bit trickier. You guys have probably talked about deduction in your Latin class. So deduction is where you're basically starting. Let me see if I can get this right. Actually, I'm going to double check myself. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry. Just wanted to make sure that I was right. So deduction is when you're starting with a large law or principle and you're applying it to a specific instance. So you're taking something that's true for lots of cases and you're showing how that's true about one particular case. So the example is Sherlock Holmes using deduction to solve crime. So he basically has certain laws or principles that he knows criminals operate under, or certain like for example in the books he wrote a whole book about how to identify somebody by their hands. So he has this like whole set of laws about how you identify somebody based on their hands, and then he's looking at a particular person's hands using his law to figure out, okay, what's the job of that person. So that's deduction. So you would say, for example, let's say that the general principle is that your younger siblings tend to steal all of the new groceries in your house. You know that's a general principle. So you come downstairs and your favorite cereal has already disappeared, and so you can deduce that your younger sibling, who usually is the culprit, was also the culprit in this case. Because you're applying that general principle to a specific instance. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. Again, if you guys have questions, be sure to email me or send me a Google chat, or on the Google Classroom. You can also stream a question. You can put a question up there and I'll see it there. So I hope you guys are doing well. I miss all of your beautiful faces, and hopefully we'll be back together soon. All right, see you later.